Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Throughout the history of this show, we've talked about nearly all the major sea powers that somehow impacted the story of pirates and piracy. Excepting the Asian nations, and Portugal to some extent, which we've yet to discuss, and we're going to discuss them a lot more in the near future, the big four here were Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands. There are obvious reasons there. So far, most of our story has taken place in the West Indies. Those four nations commanded the sea power necessary to claim their own slices of the New World, but three of them were relative newcomers to the game. The Netherlands, as an independent nation, were a newcomer to the world, and once they gained their independence, they did build a navy, but they still had to rely on pirates and privateers for some time. Nationally speaking, France had virtually no navy to speak of outside of a basic coast guard. They had 2 coastlines to protect, as well as 2 borders with enemies on either side. They were more interested in naval protection and land-based warfare for most of their history, that is until Cardinal Richelieu came along. And England, surprisingly enough, wouldn't even have a royal navy until 1660. And the rise of the Netherlands and France and England all happened in the 17th century. But before that century, before most of the events around which this show has so far been focused, European sea power looked a lot different. We've looked at some of that since we began our discussion of the Barbary pirates. The big player in the 1500s was Spain, obviously, and that included their subordinate nations, countries like Portugal and the Spanish Netherlands and Naples, all of that thanks to Charles V. Beyond Spain, though, and discounting Northern Europe and the Baltic nations here, there were basically only 3 other nations with any real sea power to speak of. There was Genoa, once they became an independent republic, and that was thanks to Andrea Doria, mostly. Then there was the Ottoman Empire, thanks to the Barbarossa brothers and Suleiman the Magnificent, mostly. And then there was Venice, and it's Venice that concerns us today. You'll notice that these are all Mediterranean nations, and that's not by accident. Until the age of exploration really got going, the Mediterranean was the focal point around which European and most Middle Eastern civilization was centered. And we'll come back to that a bit later. But for now, Venice. Venice became the eminent sea power sometime in the mid to late medieval period, mostly due to the Crusades. Spain, during the Crusades, was a bit preoccupied with the whole not really existing thing, and then the Reconquista. Venice, though, they had to have a strong navy. They were close to the Byzantine Empire, as well as Jerusalem and the Muslim world. They were close to the Crusades. But Venice excelled throughout her whole history when it came to naval power. In truth, their navy was their strongest asset. Well, their wealth, but then their navy. Venice attempted to, and occasionally even succeeded at controlling the Adriatic Sea, the sea between Italy and the Balkans, and they would extend that control to the Aegean and the Ionian seas whenever they were able. There was a lot of talk of rebuilding the Roman Empire in those days. Of course, there was the Byzantine Empire, they still existed, but Constantinople found themselves kind of between a rock and a hard place here. On one side, there were the encroaching forces of Islam, but on the other, there were the encroaching forces of Catholicism. The Byzantine Empire may have been a Christian state and may have been an extension of the Roman Empire, but those in Catholic Europe saw them, more than anything else, as a Greek Orthodox state. Rome especially wanted a Catholic successor to the Roman Empire, not this Greek Empire. They'd tried to build one several times throughout the medieval period. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in medieval history here, but Rome created what was later called the Latin Empire in much of Greece and Eastern Europe. The Latin Empire as opposed to the Greek Empire. Venice, though, oversaw most of the Latin Empire's sea power, including the ports. Now, the Latin Empire fell apart, fairly quickly actually, but the Pope granted Venice continued control of many of the ports and islands that they had been in charge of. But with the fall of the Latin Empire, the Venetians needed a name for their own empire, and they called it the Domini del Mar, or the Dominion of the Sea. Now, keeping control of those imperial possessions was integral to the later Crusades and eventually to the struggle against the Ottoman Turks. They were the entry points into Greece, Eastern Europe, and the Crusader states. Spain, Rome, France, everyone agreed that they were integral to their plans, but it was Venice's job to keep those ports safe. Everyone sent soldiers to help. They would man the barricades of those Venetian ports, but more than anyone, it was Venice and her exquisite navy that really kept them safe. If those barricades did fall and an invading army came in and took over, the Venetians could bombard them from the sea until they left. At the time, before Barbarossa, before Suleiman, really there was no one in the Mediterranean who could compare with the Venetian Republic for their sea power. But that raises the question, if Venice was such a big deal when it came to oceanic power, why didn't we talk about them until we went back in time? Why haven't we mentioned Venice until we went to talk about Barbary? Why didn't Venice have a stake in the New World? Why weren't they a competitor of Spain in their global empire? As for that question, it might have made more sense for them to travel to the East Indies, but they didn't do that either. So what happened here? What was the fate of the Domini del Mar? This is episode 94, Pride Cometh. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, things began to change rapidly for Venice. It was suddenly on the front lines of an increasingly violent conflict with Islam. There is an almost perfect analogy for what happened here, but I'm not going to use it. It's a little too nerdy and a little too obscure for most of our listeners. For anyone who would get it, all I'll say is Taishar Malkier. And if you're nerdy enough to get that reference, take this into account. The crane, for example, the golden crane, has long been a symbol in Greek and Roman tradition, as well as in European heraldry, for a century. Way back in the day, Pliny the Elder wrote that cranes would appoint a sentry to stand guard all night, and that sentry would hold a stone in its mouth to keep from falling asleep. That image as a sentry or a guard became the central image for the crane in most of medieval history, kind of like the Byzantine bulwark against Islam. But the fall of Constantinople was bad news for Venice. Being on the front lines is never as good as having someone to take the brunt of the attack while you support them from behind, but it actually spurred Venice to build and maintain a stronger naval presence. For years, for decades even, the Venetians fought hard alongside the Knights Hospitalier to defend and recapture parts of Greece and the Balkan coast. Then, Venice was introduced to the brothers Barbarossa. Now, we've talked at length about that story already. For Venice, though, it was a trying but ultimately rewarding experience, if a bit bittersweet. They had an armada of galleys, who were top-of-the-line galleys, really. Some of them, many of them even, were larger than any ship that would be seen for decades to come. It was Venice that was at the center of, and oftentimes the head of, the Holy League that, well, they lost the Battle of Prevesa, but they were also the head of the Holy Alliance that won the Battle of Lepanto. Spain, Genoa, Naples, the Papal States, they all played a major part, but it was Venice that had the most ships invested in both of those large battles, in the entire war against the Ottoman Empire. Ultimately, the Catholic world came out on top, and Venice appeared poised to control the Mediterranean. However, the Battle of Lepanto is famous not just for the victory of Catholic Europe, but also for being the last major sea battle that utilized the galley, at least in any numbers. Spain didn't even bring any galleys to the Battle of Lepanto. They brought in an armada of galleons, and Spanish galleons were busy conquering the New World at this point. England, France, and the Netherlands were building their own fleets to follow suit. But Venice, the power in the Mediterranean, well, they were lagging behind in the arms race. Venice's fleets of galleys were quickly, very quickly, growing obsolete. Now, they did have a few galleons, but not enough to compete. This became undeniably apparent when a pirate named Simon Danziger brought the round ship to Barbary. This was a problem of location. The Venetians and the Ottoman empires still relied mostly on galleys, and that's because they were centered in the Mediterranean. Most of their sea travel was based in the Mediterranean, and galleys were great for the Mediterranean. But Spain, England, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands, they were all Western European countries that touched the Atlantic Ocean. The galley was okay, but it would not cross the ocean, which was their ultimate goal. For that, they needed larger round ships, which is why a Dutchman, Danziger, brought the round ship to the pirates on the Barbary coast. Now, the Ottomans were aware of the round ship at this time. Any that they built at their seaports were used in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, rather than the Mediterranean, where they were seen as somewhat unnecessary. And these European pirates, namely Ward and Danziger, to start off, were very, very successful. It showed the superiority of the round ship to the galley. So Barbary began. Well, at first the pirates would steal ships and bring them to Barbary to be sold, but eventually they started building their own. Now, Venice did have those few galleons that I mentioned, but not enough to combat the fleet, the armada that was being built there in Barbary. Their only saving grace, and it really wasn't much of one, is that this armada was fractured. There wasn't a central command. Despite the fact that they were all technically part of the Ottoman Empire, they were really independent city-states building their own fleets. But then, John Ward, at one point in his career, set out to raid a convoy of Venetian merchant ships. This happened on that last fateful voyage of his, after he heard about the Venetian plan to block his pardon and went to attack as many Venetian ships as he was able. But the Senate of Venice caught wind of this, and they sent two of their top admirals, Girolamo Memo and Cristoforo de Canal, to stop John Ward, to capture him if possible, but to sink him and kill him if necessary. John Ward embarrassed them. These were skilled admirals, but John Ward outplayed them completely. And it's not that John Ward was necessarily a better sailor or a better commander. It's just that the tools of those Venetians were inferior. They were sailing on board galleys. Ward chased them off. They came to sink him, and he just chased them away. And then John Ward just sat in the shipping lane where he knew they would be coming, that merchant fleet, and he captured any vessel that he fancied. Now, he stopped and boarded a number of vessels and took any treasures on board that he cared to, but he only took 2 ships for his own. They were the galleons Balbi and Spelegato. They were the only ships that, in Ward's estimation at least, were worth taking. He didn't want any of the galleys. He wanted their cargo, maybe some of the crew, but the ships themselves were just a liability, and expense that wouldn't pay for themselves. While John Ward did as he pleased with this entire armada of merchant ships, those 2 admirals on board their galleys, well, they were just kind of sitting off to the side and watching. They were able to aid and abet those who had just been attacked by John Ward, but not to stop them at all. They tried to go and warn some of them, but John Ward prevented them from doing so. As I said, it was an embarrassing situation. The Venetians could no longer ignore their need for a fleet of war galleons. But at this moment, they only had a few that were seaworthy that could hope to compete against John Ward. They ordered their best 3 to head a fleet of galleys and to go hunt Ward down. This was that Venetian fleet intended to destroy Ward and then sail on to Tunis, potentially to engage the English fleet in the Mediterranean. But that was when John Ward left Ionian waters and sailed on for the Aegean, and that was where he would lose his flagship, the Rainieri Soderini, in a storm. And when Venice heard about this, as we discussed last time, Venice called their ships back. And that proved to be a fatal mistake for them. Not a mistake that was obvious quite yet, but it was. See, one of John Ward's lieutenants stayed behind in those Ionian waters, near where John Ward had captured those 2 galleons. Now, those 2 galleons were given into the command of this captain, a man named Jan Kasten, a Dutchman, and he thought that these were prime hunting grounds, so he stuck around. And for the most part, Jan Kasten was right here. He did well out there on the Mediterranean, capturing a few merchant vessels, until he was happened upon by 3 Venetian warships. They surprised him. They got the jump on him. Now, these weren't monsters of warships, nothing like the Rainieri Soderini. They weren't even galleons. They were galleys, but they were large ones, and they were under the capable command of Admiral Julio Venier. He was in the largest of the 3, and the other 2 were actually those same 2 galleys that Ward had chased off just a few weeks before, so they knew where this pirate would be. Now, the galleys engaged Jan Kasten, but to little effect. They were in close with the pirate fleet, and even though the Venetian galleys had the best guns that money could buy, the pirate ships could carry far more, even if their guns were less powerful. The Venetians were forced once again to turn tail and run. They fled up the Peloponnesian coast for several leagues, but they did, apparently, have a plan. Author Greg Bach writes, quote, Castin, no doubt inspired by memories of Ward's great lopsided encounters, then made one fateful error. He pursued the Venetians. His decision to do so is so utterly at odds with the privateer's code, which dictates no pursuit of prizes whose capture would cost more than they were likely to yield. Nonetheless, Castin, perhaps intoxicated by having, like his master, put the Venetian war galleys to flight, thought to press his advantage. In doing so, he fell into Venier's trap. End quote. See, there were a lot of advantages that the galleons and all the round ships had. That's why they were quickly becoming the norm in the Mediterranean, but there was one thing that galleys still had, and really, in a way, always had above them, and that was maneuverability. The oars on board, though costly in weight and manpower and space, just couldn't be beat when it came to quick, sharp turns. Jan Castin was chasing the Venetians up the coast and closing in fast, but Admiral Venier was, well, historian Alberto Teniti writes in Piracy and the Decline of Venice, quote, The Venetian admiral acted with great cunning. He knew that his own guns had a longer range than those of his opponent and pretended to flee. End quote. That's what Greg Bach calls Venier's trap. Now, I think both of these authors may be giving Admiral Venier a bit more credit than he's really due, especially Teniti. When he says that the Venetians pretended to flee, I don't think that's accurate. I think they were fleeing. Jan Castin just had them outgunned. But a good admiral, a good commander on any battlefield, knows when to run and when to fight, and they know how to set up the potential for victory. But for that potential to be realized, the enemy has to play along. So I don't think he set up this trap by pretending to flee. I think he fled. Venier was running. He had to run, and he didn't know that Jan Castin would follow him. But Castin did follow, and the admiral was aware of what he could do in that situation, and that's when he sprang the trap. Right when Jan Castin came in range of those top-of-the-line guns, but when he was still too far away to fire on the Venetians himself, that Venetian admiral used those spectacular oars to stop and turn on a dime, and that's when they opened fire with everything they had. They opened up with what Bach calls, quote, a fearful and furious torrent of great shot, end quote. But then they followed that up. They had a volley of chain shot that tore through the rigging of the pirate galleons, and then another volley of grape shot that tore through the pirates on deck. This was a flawlessly executed maneuver, and it ended in a slaughter. Blood poured through the scuppers and tattered sail drifted listlessly down into the sea. A total of 50 pirates were killed in just a few minutes of firing, no more than half a dozen volleys. But when the smoke cleared from all of that destruction, Venier, in his untouched galley, made for Castin's galleon, and he captured the 45 men that were left on board. The other two vessels, the two ships that had been forced to watch as John Ward made fools out of them, well, they sailed on the other two galleons in Castin's fleet, the same two that John Ward had captured, and then they took those ships back. In truth, this was a great victory. The Venetians had triumphed completely, and their galleys had won the day over the galleons of the pirates. And that right there, this miraculous victory, was the nail in Venice's coffin. Some centuries later, not so far away from this battlefield, Winston Churchill would attempt to capture the Dardanelles in World War I, and he would fail to do so. He would occasionally blame this on the sentiment of the captains that were working under him. See, they had old wooden sailing vessels that were intended, according to Churchill, to be used to clear the mines from the water by running into them. They were supposed to run in as suicide ships. That was the plan. But Churchill said that their captains were reluctant to sacrifice the ships that they had first sailed on. These were ships that they loved dearly, and they didn't want to see them sunk, at least not so gratuitously. And I can understand that it can be hard to give up a tradition to which you are attached, but it can be especially hard when you have one very convincing piece of evidence that tells you that that tradition is better than the incoming replacement. Now, the captains working under Winston Churchill didn't have anything like that, but the Venetians did, right here, in this battle that they won so spectacularly. The cunning of Admiral Venier in using his galleys to overpower the much more powerful galleons became something of a parable, sort of a David and Goliath story for the Venetian navy. Clever cunning and the proper use of tried and tested tools overcame brute strength. So, on the strength of that one victory, Venice made the decision to sideline their galleon-building program and focus on bigger and better galleys. And that seemed to make sense. It made sense to the heart, obviously. They loved their galleys, but it made sense to the head as well, considering the strength of this victory. The name of today's episode is Pride Cometh. That's actually the beginning of a misquote from the King James Bible. That verse correctly reads, quote, "Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall," end quote. But growing up, I always heard it simplified as pride cometh before the fall. And that proved to be the case for the Republic of Venice. In many ways, Venice was the heir of Rome. Not the Roman Empire necessarily, but the city of Rome and the culture of Rome. Of course, Rome itself still existed, but so many of the families that made up Rome, once Rome fell to the barbarian invaders, left for Venice. Many of the families that were the most powerful in the Venetian Republic were the same, although by different names, that had led the original Roman Republic. Admirably, stubbornly, these noble families resisted the Carolingian dynasty of Charlemagne to forge their own republic out of the ashes of Rome, and they built alliances with the surviving Roman Empire, the Byzantines, and that made them essential. They became a waypoint between the Greek Empire and the Latin Empire, the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, a republican core to the two halves of the former Roman Empire. Venice was at the center of that. Now, lofty ideas aside, the reality of this meant that they became a trading nation. They had access to water and land routes between both halves of European former Roman society. And all of that rested on their galleys. And those galleys were not so different from those that had been used at Troy by the Greeks. They weren't so different from the galleys that the Phoenicians had used when exploring and colonizing the Mediterranean and, founding Carthage. They weren't all that different from the vessels that Pompey Magnus used when he defeated the Cilician pirates in modern-day Turkey. They were similar, much more similar than those others, to the ships that were used at the height of the Roman Empire, and that were used by the Byzantines against the encroaching Islamic forces. And once again, throughout all this history, once again they had proven their worth. But of course, if this was an experiment, a scientific experiment, this would be called a false positive. Ships, sailing vessels, and in particular the galleon, were so superior to the galley in so many ways that to ignore their virtues, as the Venetian Republic did, well, that's at least a part of what brought down this vestige of Roman power. The influence and prestige of Venice would decline, but the Republic clung on for a couple more centuries. All the while, their great republic was being chipped away piece by piece until, finally, a conquering emperor who saw himself in many ways the heir of Rome, a man named Napoleon Bonaparte, conquered and destroyed them. Naturally, that is an extremely truncated and oversimplified rendition of the fall of the Venetian Republic. Economically, they lost much of their power because the Mediterranean was no longer the center of trade in the world. The Atlantic and Indian and Pacific Oceans became huge in trade, and it was so much cheaper for Spain or Portugal or England or the Netherlands or even France to do it than it would have been for them to do so. So yeah, it's a lot more complicated than, pirates did it, but as a sort of historic parable, that story works really well. And it even has a moral at the end. Pride cometh before the fall. Who else do we know in this story to which that idea applies? Who was puffed up with vain glory, only to have that dashed and taken away? Who thought that they were at the top of the world? Who was, in many ways, at the top of the food chain, only to find themselves at the bottom? Whose story so perfectly mimics that of the fall of Venice that it's almost as though some extraordinarily clever and handsome podcaster came along and made that the theme of an episode? Of course, I'm talking about John Ward, the arch-pirate and most feared captain in the Mediterranean. Before we get started today, I'd like to address a couple of things. First, a touch of housekeeping. Last time, I neglected to mention one of our Commodores at the opening of the show, the pirate Nopales, so I'd like to apologize for that and offer them an honorary captaincy for the day, maybe. I really appreciate all of your support, and I do apologize about that. But secondly, about last time, I cut the episode a bit short. I had a much longer episode outlined, and it involved a lengthy segment of quotations. Those quotes were intended to showcase another point of view about the topic around which today's show is centered. A point of view that's different from my own or the other Western historians who I use as sources. But a couple of things happened. First of all, it felt incomplete at the end of last week's episode. I didn't have the time to get the entire story I wanted to in there. And secondly, I got really annoyed while reading one of those quotes, and instead of staying on topic as I had intended to, I just sort of jumped headfirst right off the rails. The topic here is, well, a bit more on that in a little bit, but it can be a sensitive topic. And I worry that my response to the quotes I read and their authors might come off as less than sensitive. I thought about not including what I recorded for last week's episode, just getting rid of it entirely, but then I realized that's my honest reaction to a scholarly opinion. Rather than dance around that or censor myself, I've chosen to leave it in its complete form in today's episode. My reaction to their opinion, when we finally get around to it, should be taken as just that. A reaction, maybe an overreaction even, but a reaction to some bad history and what I see as poor historical analysis, and maybe even a criticism of the reckless choices that the author made. What it is not is a slam against the author themselves, who I'm sure is a lovely person and an intelligent scholar in other regards. Nor is it a larger commentary on any community or creed. If you'd like my personal views on that sort of thing, they're very simple, and I'll give them at the outset. I believe in the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Follow that, and your business is none of mine, and I wish you all the best. With all that said, and hopefully with all my bases covered, I'm going to jump in and begin with the second half of last week's show before moving on. This is episode 95, Pride Cometh, Part 2. Pride cometh before the fall. Who else do we know in this story to which that idea applies? Who was puffed up with vain glory, only to have that dashed and taken away? Who thought that they were at the top of the world? Who was, in many ways, at the top of the food chain, only to find themselves at the bottom? Whose story so perfectly mimics that of the fall of Venice that it's almost as though some extraordinarily clever and handsome podcaster came along and made that the theme of an episode? Of course, I'm talking about John Ward, the arch-pirate and most feared captain in the Mediterranean. He returned home to Tunis with his tail between his legs. He'd lost his great warship, the Rainieri Soderina, and with her, he'd lost a significant investment in guns and time and labor. All of that, though, was nothing compared to the loss in human lives. 350 sailors died when the Soderina sank. All of them were Muslim. All of them were native sons of Barbary. However, Ruby and Little John, his other ships, made it safely back to Tunis with crews full of European pirates, and all of them were very safe, very dry, and very much alive. Adrian Tinniswood writes in Pirates of Barbary, quote, Ward faced a bitterly hostile reception when he sailed into Tunis without the Soterina and without her crew. The friends of the lost men wanted to know how it was that the English admiral had survived when their loved ones hadn't. End quote. I do wonder how that immediate, initial reception went for John Ward. I mean, right after he put in and everyone crowded the docks, what happened? The return of someone like John Ward was always a moment of celebration. Not only did they usually bring in plunder and plenty of money to spread around, but they usually brought friends and family home. They shared happy reunions. Now everyone who lived in Tunis knew that sailors in that line of work lived a dangerous life. Any sailor, even legitimate sailors, might not make it back home due to storm or sickness or a myriad of other causes, and Corsairs in particular were more likely to die in the pursuit of their prizes. All of those friends and family members who were there at the dock, well, they were aware that bad news might come home with Jack Ward. They were, you might even say, prepared for it. But the Soterina wasn't there at all. I wonder if they had a moment where they thought, was she lagging behind, or was she on another mission? And I wonder if Jack Ward broke the news there on the dock, or did he rush home to his alabaster palace and her tall, strong walls? Did Ward forbid his men from speaking of anything that had happened out there, at least, until he and the officers had been safely hidden away, or did the news break immediately? Did the people that were there waiting for their loved ones at the docks, did they storm Ward and his men when they realized what had happened? Were they demanding answers of him? Were Ward and the other officers hounded back to the fortress? Maybe they had their swords drawn. Maybe they were incurring curses and stones and wrath. Well, Tinniswood continues, quote, For a time, Ward didn't dare walk the streets for fear of the outcries and cursings blown in his ears of wives, fathers, and kindred, for the loss of so many of their friends at one blow. And it was only the continued support of Uthman that enabled him to recruit a crew. Even then, no Turk would sail with him. End quote. Holed up in his mansion, unable to walk the streets and unwilling at the moment to go back out on the sea, this was a desperate time for John Ward. He was at his lowest and his weakest. Oddly, despite his desperate fortunes, back in England his legend grew even larger, thanks to the English agent Henry Pepwell. Pepwell spent a lot of his time in Barbary, and he was there on a number of missions, but one of them was to find out as much as he could about Jack Ward and what had happened to the Soterina. And that's when he heard that John Ward was alive. He wrote back to England to tell the Crown and Council all about it. He told them that John Ward, quote, beyond a doubt the greatest scoundrel that ever sailed from England, end quote, had escaped death, somehow. Now, Pepwell and John Ward had a sort of relationship. Pepwell had been behind giving messages to the Crown and Council about John Ward's request for pardon. They knew each other and were, on one level, almost friends. But not quite. You aren't usually friends with someone who you consider to be the greatest scoundrel ever. But the news that he was alive was big news in England, and it was around this time when word of that broke that the writers and pamphleteers in London, and all around Europe really, picked up on Ward's story. This was no longer just a curiosity for the newspaper or something to be discussed in the halls of power. This was a story. In the mind of those writers, Ward was some kind of unnatural creature, someone who was beyond evil and perhaps unable to be killed, perhaps quite literally in league with Lucifer. Tinniswood continues, quote, Europe still regarded Ward as a sinister puppet master, directing a vast pirate fleet from his stronghold in Tunis, end quote. And of that stronghold, the pamphlet News from the Sea writes, quote, Uthman gave him a ruined castle in the city, and on the site he built a mansion, a stately house far more fit for a prince than a pirate, end quote. That's not exactly how it went. The palace was already in fine repair. John Ward just inhabited it. It was that same treasury fortress that he had been living in for some years now, but they wanted to build Ward up in these stories. See, the image they portrayed about John Ward was, Well, first of all, it was in stark contrast to the scared and broken old man that was hiding in that palace in Tunis. But in their minds, in the minds of the writers and the people living in Europe, every pirate that was operating in the Mediterranean was, well, they were described as a follower of John Ward, from Francis Verney, who actually was, to Simon Danziger, who was at best an associate, to pirates that were operating out of Egypt or Greece or Morocco, people who had likely never met John Ward, maybe never even heard of him. But in reality, John Ward was hemorrhaging followers at a truly alarming rate. Greg Bach writes of that time, quote, "Ward had lost the trust of his men, and they would not abide his command without muttering and mutiny. Among Christian seamen it was said that Ward favored Muslims, while Muslims held that Ward was using them as swabs and cannon fodder. Nonetheless, the fact remains that Ward was unwilling or unable to put to sea following his disastrous outing on the Soterina. Instead, Ward spent his days ashore, isolated in his mansion." End quote. See, the storytellers were building this image of Ward up to be this caricature of an evil pirate, but the reality was, well, kind of depressing. And it's at this point, looking at the reality of the story, that some modern, and not quite modern, but after the fact, historians choose to bring up the question of John Ward's pardon. Now, we talked at length about his pardon already, but I mentioned that there was another theory or another idea. But really the reality is that some authors, rather than historians, choose to do this. And dramatically, this makes a lot of sense. Of course, Ward would seek pardon from King James when he was at his lowest and weakest. It doesn't make sense when you're crafting a narrative for the arch-pirate to seek pardon when he was at the height of his power, when he had a warship and a fleet and hundreds of loyal men. Why would he do that? So, many of these writers wait to tell that part of the story until Ward is weak, and it makes sense on a dramatic level. No, I'm not saying they misrepresent the facts necessarily, at least the modern writers don't, but they do choose to talk about the pardon after they talk about the loss of Rainieri Soterina, and that can be a bit misleading. It's almost certain that John Ward did bring up the question of the pardon again, probably to Henry Pepwell. But England, this time, was having none of it. They'd narrowly averted a war with Venice, and without the Rainieri Soterina, John Ward was much less of a threat. Both of those were good reasons to ignore John Ward's request, but that money was still a potential, a possibility. But there was another reason, a reason above all others that England refused to even hear of a pardon from John Ward, a reason that outweighed even their greed. John Ward had converted to Islam. When I said that many of those writers believed that John Ward was quite literally in a pact with Satan, they believed that this conversion to Islam was evidence of such a pact. The assumptions and the denunciations that followed the news were fast and fierce. The reason that flood of writers and pamphleteers and poets all decided to write about John Ward was this. It was what they considered his singular betrayal, and they really saw it as a betrayal. I mean, yeah, he'd already jumped ship and turned pirate and chosen the outlaw's path, but there was that little corner in every English person's mind that sort of admired that sort of audacity. The sins of John Ward were obviously many, but the English have this tradition of folk tales like those about Robin Hood, which Ward actively embraced. The national heroes of England weren't men like the King or men like Cecil. They were scoundrels who made good, men like Sir Francis Drake and Thomas Cavendish. And on the other hand, yeah, the better angels of the mythological nature of England strove for the chivalric ideals of King Arthur, but when the ruler was unjust, take Prince John from the Robin Hood tale, or hypothetically say that the king was a foreign king who was a suspected Catholic sympathizer and the son of a French Catholic woman who good Queen Bess herself had imprisoned more than once and who had single-handedly destroyed the entire privateering industry. Say that hypothetical king was on the throne, the English might see something a bit almost patriotic about, going rogue, going pirate. And in America, this is something I think we all understand, this ideal of the noble outlaw, of the reluctant rebel. It's a trope in most of our greatest stories. All the best cowboy stories and, pirate stories, well, they didn't come down to the U.S. with our revolution. We inherited that from the English and built upon it. So that little bit of sympathy remained in the English mind for John Ward until it came out that he had converted. There was nothing remotely patriotic about abandoning the Anglican faith and the very last vestige of what made him English in the first place. And what's more, reports were coming in that John Ward had abandoned his own name. He was calling himself Yusuf Rais, and he was holding court over his pirate empire from his alabaster palace. And in these tales told in England, John Ward had begun to exhibit all the clichés of both Islam and North Africa, as told in Europe at the time. He had harems filled with scantily clad concubines, both men and women, and scandalously young. There were silks and opium and sumptuous food everywhere. The bacchanals thrown by Ward and his associates had become things of legend. In the minds of the English, at least, he had a team of chefs, over a dozen of them, including 2 to prepare his meat, not to mention all of the undercooks working for those chefs. And they would prepare feasts the likes of which no one in England had ever seen. Ward himself had 2 personal food tasters, just in case one was tempted to sacrifice his own life to kill the pirate. Mind-altering substances that were known to be prolific in Barbary flowed freely at these bacchanals, and armies of young men and women attended to the pirates to see to their every need. The writers who were inventing these tales hinted at everything, but they always demurred and claimed that everything that happened was too scandalous for any good Christian to put to paper. So you can see why the play about John Ward, a Christian turned Turk, was such a hit. It was a bestseller, and there were ample opportunities when it was put on stage for a good bit of violence and sex and all manner of depravity, so they always put on a good show. But don't forget that there was a moral here that all of that stuff was of the devil, so no one had to feel guilty to go see a production of the play. But there's one piece of evidence that might suggest that there's some truth in these rumors. I say might, it's not proof, but there was a merchant named John King that arrived in Barbary later that year with a hold full of cheap English ale. He traded a ton of that ale, and when I say ton here, I mean T-U-N. That's an old English unit of liquid by volume rather than weight. It's equal to about 240 to 250 gallons. Now, John King traded a ton of cheap ale for an equal amount of good and very expensive Alicante wine. The man on the other end of that trade was John Ward. Now, this was given as proof of John Ward's debaucherous ways, and, 250 gallons of ale does seem to suggest that, but how about this? He had already taken this ship full of wine. He had plenty of it, but he and his men, they wanted to go home. At least we know John Ward and some of his captains did. Maybe they were missing England a little bit, and maybe that cheap English ale, maybe the profit they could have made on selling that wine elsewhere was worth the loss to have a taste of home. That debaucherous image of Ward is counter to the facts that we have, which are slim. As evidence of the English attitude towards this pirate Yusuf Rais, formerly known as John Ward, you can take the poem written by Samuel Rowlands. He says, quote, "Thou wicked lump of only sin and shame, denouncing Christian faith and Christian name, a villain worse than he that Christ betrayed." And he's talking about Judas Iscariot here. The phrasing is a bit confusing, but he goes on, quote, "Receive this warning from thy native land. God's fearful judgments, villain, are at hand. Devils attend, hellfire is prepared, perpetual flames is reprobate's reward." End quote. I'm curious as to whether prepared would have been pronounced prepard or whether reward would have been pronounced rewared. But When the author writes reward at the end of that, it's written R-E-Ward with a capital W. Now, reward was originally a compound word, and R-E-Ward is the traditional spelling, so it kind of fits here, but even by 1600, it was an archaic spelling. And when you add in the capitalization of the W, well, it makes it a pretty clear, clever little indictment of John Ward. So that was the prevailing attitude there in England. John Ward had a future of eternal damnation to look forward to, but that does raise the question of, well, why did Ward convert in the first place? And we're going to look at that, but before we do, I'd like to look at John Ward's conversion to Islam from the other side, from the side of Muslim commentators on Yusuf Rais. I'd like to, but I had trouble with this. I'm certain that there are probably a ton of interesting takes on John Ward from the point of view of Islamic scholars out there, both in the past and in the modern day, but I couldn't find any of those. If they exist, they're probably either hidden in books I don't know about or in other languages. I do have two sources, though, that are distinctly from the point of view of Islamic scholars. However, one of those sources is reputable, and the other is not. Both of them, though, are Western academics who were born into a more traditional Judeo-Christian society that then converted to Islam. So we have to take that into account. Now, one of them is a writer who I've mentioned on the show before that I find to be a reprehensible human being, and his views are not worth discussing, so let's throw that out the window. But the other is a respected English academic. He was born Timothy Winter, but he took the name Abdal Hakim Murad, and he's something of a leader in the English Muslim community. I don't know terribly much about him, but his Wikipedia page tells me that he had a fantastic education both in England and in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Yemen. And now he's a professor in England, focusing on Islamic studies. But that gives him a unique perspective, I think. Writing about an English pirate who converted to Islam, well, there's very few other people who would have the same point of view about that. But it's far from impartial. He's, at best, a flawed source, so I hesitate to use it, but I'll let his own words speak for themselves. He published a paper in 2003 about John Ward the pirate and wrote, quote, "For centuries, historians have debated the significance of one of the most stirring episodes in the history of Britain's Muslim minority. Men such as Captain John Ward of Kent astounded their compatriots by proudly adopting Islam to fight the Inquisition and the expansionist powers of Europe. Contemporaries called such men Corsairs. They themselves considered themselves mujahideen. Some were among the most pious Muslims this country has yet produced. The adventurer John Smith, later Disneyfied thanks to his romance with Princess Pocahontas, was one English traveler who saw these Muslims firsthand. He wrote a book, The True Travels and Adventures, to describe the European Muslims who were fighting for the crescent against the cross. Leading the list were men of Holland and England who, disgusted by religious wars in their own countries and unpersuaded by trinities and vicarious atonements, took the turbant of the Turk." End quote. I do question how the author knows what these men considered themselves, mujahideen or otherwise, considering very few of them could write, and neither John Ward nor Simon Danziger left written records behind. The only things we have at best are second-hand accounts. Now perhaps he has accounts in Turkish or Arabic that I don't. I don't know that to be the case, though. But then, this particular scholar goes on to spout a whole bunch of nonsense. He calls, first of all, Captain Danziger one of the mujahideen in question, and that, as we will shortly see, is not the case at all. But then he says, quote, "Until the arrival of these European adventurers, the coastal ports of North Africa had been unused to war." End quote. And when he's talking about those European adventurers, he's clearly talking about John Ward and Simon Danziger. I'll read that again. "Until the arrival of these European adventurers, Ward and Danziger, the coastal ports of North Africa had been unused to war." And okay, how far back do you want to go here? Do you want to go to Rome? How about the fact that Scipio Africanus gained his name due to a war in North Africa, which is one of the most important conflicts in all of world history? But sure, that's a long time ago, so let's look a bit later. How about the Vandal invasions? Was that war enough for you? How about the violent conquest of those lands and those port cities by the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates? How about the horrific way that they both put down Berber rebellions in those cities? What about the Ottoman Empire and their conquest of North Africa? And then, how about the century of war between the Corsairs and all of Catholic Europe? My mind is boggled. I can't believe someone with those kinds of qualifications and that level of education would say something so stupid. I want to blame this on apologism. I want to say that the author is trying to divert any blame that might be leveled toward any Muslim Corsairs on their Western counterparts. That would be false. That would be misleading. That would be disingenuous and hypocritical. But at least it's a motivation that I can wrap my mind around. I can understand why somebody would do that. But two things. First, if Abd al-Hakim Murad wanted to blame all of the warfare that came to the Barbary coast, wanted to say that it was all brought down upon the, poor, oppressed, downtrodden Ottoman-appointed overlords of those cities, even if the author wanted to blame all that on the vile and detestable European Catholics, Charles V is right there. The Holy Roman Emperor himself, and he goes on and on about how bad the Inquisition was, and they were, but this guy was the head of the Inquisition, literally the leader of it, and he personally invaded Barbary twice. So he could stick to that narrative without saying that these pirates brought war to North Africa. And then second, if there were a Muslim apologist that wanted to paint men like Hizir Barbarossa in a flattering light, I could understand that. Hizir Barbarossa was, in many ways, kind of a founding father to Barbary, and he was an impeccably talented seafarer and, in many ways, a talented governor. So if you want to paint him as an admiral and a pasha rather than a pirate, I can understand that. The English for a long time did the same thing with Henry Morgan. But his entire career, and his brother's career, and the people that came before him, well, it was built on war. Barbarossa led armies. He was the military governor of Algiers. So how can you say that these cities were unused to war when he personally captured them himself twice? I just can't. That's just so unbelievably dumb. Now, I should say this author is an Islamic scholar, but not a historian. But come on, that's just such obvious crap. I don't see that as an excuse. It just exhibits a fundamental misunderstanding of the time and of the players, and all I can see is just a blatant attempt for the most biased kind of historical revisionism. You know what? I'm not going to bother with that other source at all. I was going to use an example from it, but it's just the same kind of utter drivel that calls Ward a brave and honorable jihadist for the Crescent against the tyrannical forces of Christian Europe, and it's frankly the same kind of poor, biased excuse for history that was taking place in Europe in the 1600s. Any modern historian with a lick of shame, and I presume any of the Islamic scholars to which I do not have access, but any of them would absolutely discuss all of the horrible atrocities that Europe was willing to dish out on other people. The Inquisition was terrible. The religious wars were terrible. But you also have to talk honestly about the other side of that equation. And this, I know it's all my fault. I couldn't find better sources, and that's my job. I wanted to find a good Muslim perspective on John Ward, but I failed to. If anybody out there can point me in the right direction, please do, and I will rectify this in the future. But, well, for now, that's what I've got. And that was essentially where last week's episode ended. So, yeah, I clearly wasn't very fond of that quote, and as it happens, I'm still not. But I've calmed down a bit, so I'd like to return to that essay with a clearer head. In that essay, entitled Ward the Pirate, Sheikh Abdal Hassan Murad, and I should have given him his proper title earlier, he writes, quote, Most Moors knew little of the sea and still less of the infernal arts of gunpowder, but they welcomed Muslims from the Mediterranean lands and from the seafaring nations of the north." End quote. Okay, so I'm going to stay calm this time. Let's unpack that a bit. The Moors, a people who lived in North Africa primarily, with hundreds and hundreds of miles of Mediterranean coastline, according to this author, knew little of the sea. If we look at that from a certain point of view, that is possibly factually accurate to a point. The word Moor, or Moorish, is somewhat fluid in definition here, so if we take it to mean perhaps the Berber people specifically, then, well, they were never really known as a seafaring people. They fished, absolutely, but they weren't much for seaborne trade and certainly not for naval warfare. But then, when we look at the larger and more commonly accepted definition of the word Moor, what we find is an archaic term for the Muslim inhabitants of Spain and North Africa during the Middle Ages. That includes the emirates and caliphates set up by the Umayyad and Abbasid conquerors, as well as the Ottomans. That includes the emirate and later the Caliphate of Cordoba. They were, especially the Caliphate of Cordoba and later on the Ottomans, they were among the most skilled, experienced, and prolific sea traders in the history of the classical world, up there with Carthage and Rome and even China, seriously. So, if we look at the more commonly accepted definition, that quote is also factually inaccurate. But as for the gunpowder bit, saying that the Moors knew less of the infernal arts of gunpowder, well, let's unpack that as well. Gunpowder originally came to China, and significantly before moving on to Europe, it traveled through the Middle East. Arabia and Turkey and Persia all certainly had access to gunpowder, and the Janissary warriors in the Ottoman Empire were a skilled and elite class of warriors that used cannon and firearms almost exclusively. But those trading routes would have traveled through Constantinople to get to Europe, so the author could almost be forgiven for saying that the Moors in North Africa would have known little of the infernal arts of gunpowder, except that Hayreddin Barbarossa brought gunpowder to the Barbary coast. He built gunpowder manufactories in Algiers, and later they were set up in Tunis and Tripoli as well, and they were in almost constant use between the time he started them and our story today in the early 1600s. So I don't know why Sheikh Abdal Hakim would say something like that. Were he not a respected proponent of Islam, I would think that all of that sounds kind of like the ramblings of a deeply racist Englishman. But that doesn't appear to be the case. He's just, poorly informed. As I said, I'm staying calm here. When speaking about the conversion of Christian Europeans to Islam as mujahideen, the author continues, and this is a long one, quote, "English Muslims were at the forefront of this movement, ranging the seas to capture first Spanish and then any Christian ship, enslaving the crew and selling the cargo as spoils of war. To this day, there is a building in the Moroccan town of Salé known as the Englishman's Mosque. Most of these individuals took the secret of their lives with them to the grave." And I'd like to pause right here. He's talking about Muslims who were converted from Christianity that became butchers or bakers or herders or anything more mundane than pirates. But he goes on, quote, "Thanks to the Spanish Inquisition, however, historians have access to information about a good number of them. One Inquisition court in the year 1610 investigated no fewer than 39 Britons. 12 of them were from the ports of the West Country. 10 were Londoners, 6 were from Plymouth, and others originated in Middlesbrough, Lyme, and the Channel Islands. In 1631, the Inquisition in the Spanish city of Murcia tried one Alexander Harris, who, as Rais Murad, had become a prominent Muslim seafarer. He was convicted, forced to convert back to Catholicism, and sentenced to 7 years as a galley slave. Another unfortunate Englishman was Francis Barnes, who admitted to the inquisitors that he had faithfully prayed and fasted, quote, in the Mahometan manner, end quote, while working as a ship's pilot at Tunis, where he was captured by Spanish raiders. In 1626, Robin Lokar of Plymouth, also known as Ibrahim, was captured by Tuscan galleys and convicted of practicing Islam. Captain Jonas of Dartmouth, known as Mami al-Inglazi, was yet another victim of these dreaded Spanish raiders. End quote. We're finally getting around to the point here. That's why I wanted to continue on with this essay by Sheikh Abdul Hakim. That's a large part of why I wanted to get to this essay in the first place. In one part to discuss John Ward, but then to move on with it. I mean, look at that list of converts, Christian, English converts to Islam. They were all pirates, and that list is far from complete. There were perhaps hundreds or even thousands of Northern European sailors that would sail down to Barbary, they would turn pirate, and they would convert to Islam. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about most of them next time when we talk about that trend in what was called the Renegados. For now, we need to return to John Ward. John Ward was now a Muslim named Yusuf Rais, and everyone hated him. Europe hated him, the Muslims there in Barbary hated him, everyone did. But why did he convert in the first place? Ward was, well, he claimed to be a devout Christian, although he never showed that through his actions. But what led him to Islam? Sheikh Abdul Hakim gives one explanation, quote, "Life in Tunis, as in the Muslim world generally, was more refined and comfortable than its equivalent in Europe, and despite several offers, Ward showed no sign of yearning for his home shores." End quote. The second part of that was obvious nonsense. We know that Ward did indeed yearn for his home shores, or at least he worked quite hard to make it look like he wanted that pardon that would allow him to return home. But that first part sort of isn't nonsense. Generally, life in Barbary and much of the Muslim world was a lot more comfortable, and in some ways more refined than life in Northern Europe. Now, the author seems to be comparing John Ward's life in Barbary to his life in England. He says that life is more comfortable than its equivalent in Europe. But John Ward's life in Barbary was in no way equivalent to his life in England. Ward was on almost the lowest rung of society that was available in England, and when he came to Tunis, he rose to the top very quickly. Obviously, life was going to be more refined and more comfortable when you're born a fisherman and suddenly you find yourself at the head of a palace. These are different circumstances, so there's an obvious problem there. But even when it was somewhat equivalent, life in Barbary was still more comfortable than it was in England. The climate, obviously, is going to be a lot better. The food, probably a lot better. And then there were the rising personal circumstances, not just the drastic personal circumstances of someone like Ward, but for all of the converts. Now, the two Muslim writers I have access to credit that comfort to the clearly superior culture of the Islamic world. They will also use that as the explanation for why so many of these Englishmen and Dutchmen all turned Turk and became what these authors consider to be loyal and pious mujahideen. I think there's a lot more to be said for the clearly improved circumstances of these Europeans. Most of them were happy in their lives as privateers, or at least moderately content. They were at least somewhat in control of their own lives and their own fortunes. Was that the case for every person in Barbary? For the butchers and the herders and the farmers and the beggars? Maybe not, but put a pin in that. We'll talk about that next time when we're talking about the other pirates. When that right to be a privateer was taken away by the king and all of those privateers were relegated back to their either naval or fishermen's lives, many of them chose to leave England and seek better fortunes elsewhere, and they found that in Barbary. When the Irish began migrating in large numbers to the United States, or when the Italians did the same thing, or the Chinese did the same thing, or a large number of Jewish people did the same thing, or a lot of Vietnamese people have done it now, whenever any large group of people from a certain ethnic or national background begin to move to a certain location around the same time, it's largely because they find that they can improve their circumstances there. This isn't controversial. This is just how it works. And that's why so many of the pirates, so many of these English and Dutch former privateers moved to Barbary. It gave them back control over their lives and their fortunes. But does that explain John Ward's conversion? I don't think it does. It explains his migration, but maybe it was because he found such a warm welcome in Islamic lands. Maybe he did find, while he was living in Barbary, a genuine and legitimate love of Islam. Maybe he just attended services and, saw the light. Maybe he saw that people in the Islamic world lived lives that were more fulfilled than people in his home country, and maybe he decided at that moment that Islam was superior. Any of that could be true, but we don't have John Ward's thoughts on the matter, and life in Barbary was, at least for him, significantly better than life in England. And I don't think that that's an argument that can be entirely discounted, but it also can't really be quantified or proven. So instead, I think we should stick with reputable sources that look at the evidence we do have. Around the time of his conversion, after returning to Tunis, John Ward had a lot of problems piling up on his plate. His one big asset, though, was his close friendship with the Dey of Tunis, Uthman Dey. But Uthman Dey died shortly after John Ward returned, and the incoming Dey, the man who succeeded him, didn't hold Ward in the same sort of friendship. In fact, they had an immediately adversarial relationship. See, the fortune that John Ward brought into Tunis, to Uthman Dey, became the personal property of Uthman Dey. And that fortune was passed down to his children, who weren't in any positions of any particular power. Now, Ward's position in the treasury of Tunis put him in charge of his own fortune and that of Uthman Dey's, now the Dey's children. The treasury of Tunis itself and the Janissary garrison's treasury was the prerogative of a different treasurer, the actual treasurer of Tunis. But that's still a bit too close for comfort for someone like the incoming Dey. So John Ward wasn't exactly forced out, but the new Dey made it very clear that he was not welcome in that position of, de facto vice treasurer any longer. When John Ward bought that ton of English ale, he didn't do so in Tunis. He did so over in Algiers. The Pasha of Algiers, Redouan Pasha, was the same man who, only about 3 or 4 years earlier, had imprisoned at least a dozen of Ward's compatriots and chased them out of Algiers with the threat of hanging, or execution at least, hanging over their head. He despised the English, and there's nothing to suggest that those feelings or his particular anger toward Ward had abated at all, except for John Ward's conversion. Both Greg Bach and Adrian Tinniswood, who I've used quite a bit on these last few weeks, they see John Ward's conversion as a decision that he felt pushed into, and I personally agree with them here. I think that this conversion was an attempt to placate the incoming Dey of Tunis, to keep his position in the treasury, but that attempt initially failed. So Ward set out to sea again. But instead of the storm of piracy that the English would have expected, John Ward ran to his old compatriot, Szymon Danziger. Now, Szymon Danziger was not Muslim, but he was Dutch, and that made him better than the English in the eyes of the Pasha, and he had actually grown quite close to Redouan Pasha. Danziger's friendship with the Pasha, I think, combined with Ward's embrace of Islam here, seems to have placated Redouan, and probably is what convinced him to accept John Ward into the city. John Ward stayed in Algiers for a little while, or not necessarily in Algiers, but operated out of Algiers. He went back to sea, back on the account. These weren't the grand voyages of his past, though. These were smaller missions, of which he was no longer in ultimate command. He was just another captain on most of them. The English, in 1600 at least, would of course tell you that this was nonsense. He was clearly pulling the strings on all of these pirates, but that wasn't the case. John Ward sailed out alongside, but not at the head of, other pirates like Danziger and Richard Bishop and Francis Verney, and a man named Mehmet Rais, also known as George Blake. More on all that next time. However, going back to Ward, The next record we have of his whereabouts that can be verified suggests kind of strongly that his conversion to Islam may have been a bit less than legitimate. In mid-1609, John Ward appeared, out of the blue, off the coast of England. He was trying, not to blockade a harbor or bombard a fortress. He was trying to smuggle himself back home. He was spotted and chased off, but he tried again, and he was rebuffed, and he tried again. That suggests to me, and to most of the historians who have written about Ward, that he was trying to get away from Barbary. He might have had more nefarious designs here, and we'll talk about all of that next week when we talk about the other pirates. But for now, if we are trying to decipher the legitimacy or the meaning of John Ward's conversion, I'll leave you with two quotes. The first is from Greg Bach. He writes, quote, "Reviewing Ward's story, it is difficult not to perceive his conversion as opportunistic. In light of his reported attempts to return to Christendom, conversion seems to have been a last resort. Nonetheless, we know that Ward took religion seriously. As he finally found acceptance and respect among the Muslims of Tunis, did Yusuf Rais also find spiritual peace? We cannot know." End quote. And since I spent so much of today's episode speaking poorly of Sheikh Abdal Hakim Murad, I would like to leave you with one final quote that I'm actually quite fond of from that essay. He writes, quote, "Later generations of English Muslims, both at home and in North Africa, admired Ward as a superb mariner, fearless in battle, and a doughty warrior for the Crescent in the free lands of the South, where church, mosque, and synagogue coexisted for centuries, and where humble birth was no barrier to glory." End quote. John Ward will be sailing alongside the pirates we talk about next time, at least for part of the story. However, except for his sudden, unexpected, and frankly terrifying appearance off the coast of England, John Ward really wasn't the major player in any of those stories. After the Soterina sank, and after all of the hubbub around his conversion died down, John Ward's life grew significantly more quiet. After those voyages alongside those other pirates, John Ward did return to Tunis. Uthman Dey's successor had died, and a new man had come to be raised to the position of Dey, who was less inclined to hate John Ward. John Ward didn't necessarily have the position of power he had once held in Tunis, but he did still own his palace, the alabaster palace that had been handed down to him by the Dey, the palace more fit for a prince than a pirate. A Scottish traveler and travel writer whose life is, frankly, the sort of exciting age of exploration life that I could only dream about, traveled to Barbary in 1615. I do intend to talk more about Lithgow's career at a later date, but in 1615, in the city of Tunis, he met an old man living in a slightly ramshackle alabaster palace named John Ward. Of course, he knew of the pirate, but John Ward wasn't what he expected. He had gathered a coterie of influential Tunisians around him. None of them were natives of the Barbary coast, but from Corsica, Sicily, Sardinia, England, the Netherlands, France, Spain, and Venice, all of them up-and-coming pirates or officials in the city government of Tunis that wanted to bask in the last vestiges of light from John Ward's glory. He still had the ability to set a fine table and tell a hell of a story, but he was no longer the pirate that he had been. He had grown old and tired, and while John Ward still did enjoy a taste for the finer things, according to William Lithgow, his favorite pastime included sitting down in front of a warm oven outside his house, alongside his friends, telling stories and watching those ovens incubate hundreds of hens' eggs and waiting for them to hatch. William Lithgow was particularly enamored with these incubators. He said they were, quote, answerable to the natural warmness of the hen's belly, upon which moderation, within 20 or 30 days, they come to natural perfection. John Ward's life was one of tumult. He was born at the bottom of English civilization. He saw religious conflict in England nearly tear his country apart. He did see good Queen Bess and William Shakespeare rise to prominence, but then he left all that behind to sail for Barbary and become, for a time, perhaps the most famous criminal in the world. John Ward was not a good person. John Ward created almost unimaginable suffering for a countless number of human lives, but there's something oddly touching about that image, about one of the most feared men who has ever lived for good reason, sitting in front of an incubator, watching the hen's eggs hatch. John Ward would live in that fashion for another 10 or 15 years, until sometime in his mid-70s, the grave finally caught up with him. And he did, in fact, have what he stated as his wish. He was buried in the sea. Next time we're going to talk about the other pirates on the Barbary coast. Szymon Dancyker and Francis Verney you both know a bit about, but it's time to continue and to conclude their stories, as well as talk about a few other major players who would rise to prominence in that last major voyage of John Ward. In the study of history, it seems like important periods all tend to center around certain big events that can be used as a sort of shorthand when discussing or teaching about those periods in history. In many cases, those events serve as catalysts for everything that would come to follow. Take Martin Luther and the 95 Theses, for example. Were his semi-legendary actions of October 31st, 1517, were they the spark that set off the Protestant Reformation and subsequently the Renaissance? I mean, no. Reality is a lot more complex than that. The printing press was a far bigger influence than Martin Luther nailing some theses to a door, in part because the printing press was used to distribute those theses around Germany and the world, as well as the Bible. And on that note, publishing a Bible in German or in English was just as revolutionary as anything that Martin Luther ever intended. Perhaps much more so. Martin Luther intended to have an internal scholarly debate. But all the same, his posting of the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door, which probably didn't happen, is seen as the event that sparked a century of radical change in Europe. And even if most historians don't actually see it that way, it's still usually taught that way, as a sort of shorthand. In terms of pirates, well, there are a lot more of these sort of huge, world-shaking events coming up in the future. So far in our story, though, the best example we have is Henry Morgan's sack of Panama in 1671. But the most obvious examples of this sort of thing comes in terms of international warfare, and we have a bunch of examples of that. In U.S. military history alone, we have things like 9/11, the Gulf of Tonkin, Pearl Harbor, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and the bombardment of Fort Sumter. And all of these events were important, but some of them were important because of the event itself, and some because the response that followed was such a big deal. Much like Luther and the 95 Theses, it was the fallout that changed the world, not the event itself. No one's going to downplay the importance of 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. They are obvious attacks against national sovereignty that have to be answered. And honestly, Fort Sumter should probably be thrown in there as well. It was a clear declaration of open war against the government of the United States. The others, though, maybe, could be seen as less cataclysmic. Not to lessen the impact on the people that lost their lives in those situations, but, for example, was the response to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand equal to the actual events of that day? I think that when World War I is the result, the answer is obviously no. Of course, like Luther and the Theses, it wasn't really the assassination of Franz Ferdinand that started the war. In that era, Europe had often been called a powder keg. This assassination was the spark, but there was going to be a spark one way or another, and Europe was going to go to war. And of course, when it comes to the U.S. in World War I, we didn't really care about the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary or yet another war between France and Germany, but it was still what began a war that we got involved in. And then, there is the case of the incident in the Gulf of Tonkin during the Vietnam War. There are plenty of conspiracy theories about really all of the events that we've mentioned so far. Those theories claim that things like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor were either false flag attacks or that they were given aid from people on our side to further their aims toward war. And you see this kind of thing a lot. The Reichstag fire in Nazi Germany, for example, it used to be generally accepted that agents within the Nazi Party either actually set the fire themselves or arranged for the fire by conspiring with an actual communist revolutionary within Nazi Germany. And I love the story that idea tells. A bunch of hardcore, dyed-in-the-wool Nazis telling a communist agitator that they secretly really hated Hitler and desperately wanted to see his regime fall, and they could help make it happen. They could ensure that the guards weren't there and leave the materials in place for him to go in and deal a severe blow. I think about a movie like that, about double agents with a murky past who begin to question their own actions and their own loyalties. However, these days, the view that the Reichstag was a false flag attack has been challenged, and pretty convincingly, but the narrative of a false flag attack still holds a place in people's minds. So even that conspiracy theory, which used to be accepted, is now being argued against. Holes are being poked in it. But in the Gulf of Tonkin, the conspiracy theory around that event is, well, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's conspiracy fact. See, in 1964, the U.S. was already involved in the war in Vietnam. We had been for years on one level or another, but it was all in a limited capacity. We're not talking about thousands of soldiers, we're talking about a few U.S. specialists going in to aid either the French or the Vietnamese troops there. But then, on the 2nd of August 1964, an American boat was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Sort of. There was a unit of U.S. gunships shelling a settlement on a nearby island when 2 or 3 North Vietnamese gunboats showed up. One of the U.S. ships, the commander, the Maddox, fired off 3 shots. Now they said, the crew and commander of the Maddox, that those 3 shots were warning shots, but the Johnson administration would later claim that those 3 shots never happened. A brief firefight broke out and ended pretty quickly. There was virtually no damage to any of the U.S. ships aside from 1 bullet hole in the superstructure of the Maddox. But then, 2 days later, on the 4th of August, a flurry of reports suddenly came into the Pentagon stating that another firefight had broken out, and this time it was serious. There were gunboats and submarines and dozens of torpedoes, all Soviet-made and commanded by the Vietnamese, and all of them were firing on the American vessels all at once. Again, the Maddox was in command. Back at the Pentagon, the Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, was already busy firing off memos to the president and his generals and planning the counterstrike. But there's one big problem with all of that. That August 4th attack never happened. Within just a few minutes, the Pentagon learned that the subs and the torpedoes weren't there. They knew almost immediately that this attack hadn't taken place. Reportedly, these reports that initially came in were from what they called ghosts in the radar. But McNamara and President Johnson went ahead with their plan anyway. They acted as though that attack had taken place, and then they told the U.S. people and the Congress that a terrible attack had occurred against U.S. troops and that President Johnson had to be given full authority to oversee the war in Vietnam. Congress passed the Tonkin Resolution, and President Johnson was given that power. And this isn't just some wingnut conspiracy theory out there. This is from, first of all, the Pentagon Papers, which were written inside the Pentagon as a history and list of objectives for Vietnam, and then were leaked to the New York Times in 1971. Later, the New York Times would say that President Johnson, quote, systematically lied not only to the public, but also to Congress, end quote. But you could still argue that they weren't valid. That leak may have been a forgery, but any doubts over their validity were dashed in 2011 when the Pentagon Papers were declassified. They went along with a report from a modern team of NSA historians who confirmed that the attack never happened, at least not like President Johnson and his administration said. In short, they confirmed that the Johnson administration lied. They fabricated a vicious attack and used that lie to go to war. Now that's an age-old tactic of those in power. People have been doing it ever since human beings fought wars. At one point in our story, not today, but later on, Spain will burn her own shipyards to get an excuse to fight the English. The gunpowder plot, when Guy Fawkes apparently tried to blow up the Parliament, well, even that's been put into question again and again. And then, in 1608, England may have done the same thing in the Mediterranean. This is episode 96, The War Against the Corsairs. Let's take a step back to the inciting incident in question here in 1608. It was that attack, or series of attacks, against two English merchantmen, the Charity and the Pearl. Looking back on those attacks from today, we have only one document to go off of. It was a letter written by an English sea captain, the captain of the Charity, from Lisbon. Charity and Pearl, though, well, they were small ships. Generally, they were inconsequential in the vast sea of merchant trading in the Mediterranean. And, well, they were far from the first to suffer at the hands of Mediterranean pirates. Their crews absolutely went through a harrowing experience, but certainly not a unique one. So why did that attack, or those attacks, why did they set off a chain of events that almost shut down English shipping in the Mediterranean? The Dutch and the French as well halted or slowed their shipping for some time. But why was it this attack? Why not the capture of dozens of other ships by Barbary pirates throughout the decades? Now, it might be that the captains responsible for these raids, namely Ward and Danseker and their underlings, were European. Perhaps, to England and the Netherlands, that seemed like evidence of a serious pirate problem rather than just, the barbarous nature of those in Barbary. But if so, why Charity and Pearl? Why not the capture of Little John, or, as it was known then, John Baptist, or the capture of York Bonaventure? Why not any of a number of other ships taken by European pirates in the previous few years? I'd like you to think about the possibility, although an unlikely possibility, that the attacks on Charity and Pearl were overblown, or maybe even falsified. Now, I don't think that's the case, but, well, look at that first incident in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 2nd, 1964. President Johnson almost had the excuse he needed to get deeper into Vietnam, but not quite. An American ship fired first and then sustained virtually no damage, and that wasn't exactly going to get the people whipped up into a war frenzy. In much the same fashion, yet another pirate raid against yet another merchant ship was nothing new and nothing to really fear, nothing to go to war over, certainly. It was merely the cost of doing business. Now, you might think that thousands of European Christians being captured and enslaved over the decades would be reason enough, but that was left mostly to local churches and religious organizations. But what about a really terrible raid? What about two ships that were attacked 3 times by almost a dozen different pirate vessels in only 5 days? What about taking their guns and their food and one of their ships and leaving them most likely to die? What about the inability of 5 armed merchant vessels to stop the pirate Danseker? That's certainly much worse than just another run-of-the-mill pirate raid. I mean, imagine you had a husband or a father or a son sailing on a merchant vessel in the Mediterranean, and then a pamphlet came out entitled News from the Sea. It described the barbarous and vile lifestyle of the pirates, and then it printed a letter detailing the many attacks on 2 small merchant ships in only a few days. Wouldn't you suddenly be very interested in the Barbary pirates? I mean, this letter made it seem like it was a nightmare out there. Wouldn't you demand that the king do something about it? If your husband or son was out there, who knows what might happen to him? That sounds to me like time for a war. Now, I'm not going to dispute the validity of that letter written by the captain here. I will strongly hint at the suggestion, but I really don't even have to do that, because Venice was asking all of those questions for me, including Zorzi Giustinian and the Senate. I will ask if the response to the capture of Charity and Pearl was equal to the attack that the letter described. Even if every word in that letter were completely true in every single respect, The Venetians saw this letter and, more importantly, the response to it, as a clandestine threat to their command of trade in the Mediterranean. Now I know that the Venetians throughout this show might look kind of paranoid with their reaction to both this event and their later reaction to the capture of Rainieri Soderini. And Zorzi Giustinian was given to paranoid flights of fancy. But on a national level, is it paranoia if it happens to be true? Both England and the Netherlands were both very interested in those Venetian-held trading routes, and they had large, new fleets of trading vessels that they wanted to put to use. And they were allowed to trade on them, but they had to pay taxes and tariffs on it. Now, I understand that this is all looking very episode 1 here, the taxation of trade routes is a very serious affair, Chancellor, so I'll stay away from all of that. But Venice was in the crosshairs, or at least the trade routes controlled by Venice were in the crosshairs of England and the Netherlands, and Venice knew it. So they said that any English naval presence in the Mediterranean, even if it was ostensibly to deal with English pirates, would be seen by them as an act of war. So England backed off, for a minute at least. Then the Soderini was captured, and everyone started gearing up to go to war in the Mediterranean again. We talked about all this at some length, Venice was saying that Ward had to be stopped, and if the English stopped them from stopping Ward, they would go to war. And the English were saying that Ward had to be stopped, and if the Venetians stopped them from stopping them, they would go to war. It was a lot of ridiculous back and forth. But things did look like war for a minute until, suddenly, John Ward sank off the coast of Greece in waters owned by Venice. And Venice just said, "Oh my, look at that, I don't know what happened over there." However, here are 2 Italian sailors with a surprisingly detailed account of the entire affair. So war was averted there, and Venice held on to her trading routes. But that didn't stop the problem of the pirates. They were still out there, and Venice was woefully unequipped to deal with them. And if they couldn't do it, and they wouldn't allow England or probably even the Dutch to do it, who was going to deal with the pirates? And it was about this time in our story that John Ward was converting to Islam and then forced to leave Tunis for Algiers. When he arrived, that brought all the major pirates in Barbary to the city of Algiers. John Ward and at least most of his followers. That means Sir Francis Verney was there. That means Bill Graves was there. That means Richard Bishop and Anthony Johnson and probably Captain Foxley and his comrades, among a lot of others whose names we don't know. And of course, Simon Danseker was there with his followers. Now, we haven't really talked much about the people following Danseker, but they were mostly Dutch, and they made up the next generation of Barbary pirates. Pirates like Simon Martsoen Struit and Grote Piet, or Big Pete, and Simon Danseker the Younger, Simon Danseker's son. And that's only scratching the surface. There were dozens of pirate ships after Ward and his folk arrived, crowding the harbor of Algiers all at one time. The Pasha may have been less inclined to execute Jack Ward now that he was known as Yusuf Rais, but that was still an awful lot of European sea rovers and brigands infesting his home and complicating trade. It was a complicated situation, but things were about to get a lot more complicated when a fleet of warships appeared on the horizon. As it happened, despite the threats from Venice, England and the Netherlands had mobilized a strike team of warships to sail for Barbary. But they didn't get there. The English fleet, at least, was stopped outside the Strait of Gibraltar, near southern Spain. Spain didn't have a dog in the fight to come, but should a war occur, they would certainly get dragged in. And they really didn't want to get dragged in. Philip III, the King of Spain, was also King of Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and the Duke of Milan. Plus, Portugal and basically the rest of the world at that point. But you might notice that all of those kingdoms I mentioned at first were in the Mediterranean. They were all Italian, and if a naval war broke out between England and Venice, well, who knows what might happen to the rest of Italy, which he basically owned. So the fleet, the English fleet, was stopped outside the channel. The King of Spain wouldn't let them in. Now, the English weren't happy with that situation, but what exactly could they do against the naval might of Spain here? Instead, as a sort of a balm, the Spanish Navy told them that they would deal with the pirates. However, the Spanish did allow in another fleet, a combined fleet from Amsterdam, Middelburg, and Vlissingen. They were allowed to pass the strait and enter the Mediterranean, and they were there to deal with the pirates as well. Now, the Venetians weren't happy about that either, and they suspected that Spain had just pulled a fast one. The Venetians believed that the Dutch fleet was there not only to deal with the pirates, but to establish trade relations with Barbary and Morocco. And they weren't exactly wrong there. Venice believed the reason Spain had done so was to allow the Dutch in, let them make those trade relationships, and then retake the Netherlands once their truce had ended and what would be known as the 80 Years' War began again. And they might not have been wrong about that. I mean, the Spanish were going to try and retake the Netherlands, they just failed to do so. But those Dutch ships, they weren't the fleet that arrived in Algiers in 1609. Do you remember a while back we talked about an English knight, a privateer, MP, diplomat, writer, and traveler named Sir Anthony Shirley? He was imprisoned by King James I, and the Parliament saw his imprisonment as illegal, and it was one of the reasons that they drafted up the form of apology and satisfaction to rebuke James I. Well, after he was released from his wrongful imprisonment, Shirley left, feeling essentially exiled from England. So he knew something of John Ward's displeasure with his home country, and Shirley was also very well acquainted with the Muslim world. He'd traveled extensively through the Muslim world, from the Ottoman Empire all the way to Persia, and actually in Persia he would be made a prince and given exclusive trading rights, and finally made an ambassador to Moscow, Prague, and Rome. So he was a former privateer, an exile from England, and he had close ties to the Muslim world, so Shirley was uniquely suited to speak with John Ward. They had a lot in common. That's why, when Anthony Shirley wrote John Ward a letter, he attempted to dissuade him from piracy and what Shirley called a villainous life. Now, Ward wanted nothing to do with all of that. It probably didn't help that when Sir Anthony Shirley wrote that letter, he was writing from Naples in his position as Admiral of King Philip III's Mediterranean fleet. It probably also didn't help that the letter from Shirley to Ward was brought by a Spanish officer under a flag of truce, sailing from a fleet that had just arrived and was currently blockading the harbor in which Ward was sitting. That letter was drawn up in the wake of the Soterina disaster, when Spain finally decided to deal with the pirates. King Philip told those English ships that they couldn't pass the channel, but he did task Sir Anthony, an Englishman, with dealing with them. So Shirley outfitted a fleet and prepared to set sail on the hunt when, he probably learned that all the pirates, including Ward, were gathered together in Algiers. More on that in a moment. But it was his fleet, Anthony Shirley's fleet, a Spanish fleet from Naples, that sailed on Algiers. Although Shirley wasn't there, he wasn't in acting command. That honor went to a man named Don Luis Fiascardio. Shirley, though, was Fiascardio's boss back in Naples. However, Fiascardio did see that the letter was delivered and got Ward's reply. What appears to have happened here is that Sir Anthony tried to lure Ward away over to Spain's side, or probably more specifically, to his side. If Sir Anthony could talk John Ward into leaving the pirate life as well as the Muslim world behind, it would be a major political move, and if he could talk him into joining his side, that would give Sir Anthony a powerful ally. And who knows here, with Sir Anthony's contacts in England, where he'd spent some time in prison, as well as Venice, where he'd spent some time in prison, and Persia, where he was a high official, and he'd spent some time in prison, and the Ottoman Empire, where he'd spent, a few days in prison, not to mention his current friends in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Well, if Sir Anthony had all of those contacts and the ally in John Ward, he might be able to do something truly bold. Maybe, with a Spanish fleet and all of his new former pirate friends, Sir Anthony could sail for Morocco and intercede in the Civil War. Maybe he could set himself up as governor of Morocco for Spain. Or maybe he could sail for Tunis, Tripoli, or Algiers and oust the local Pasha there. Maybe he could set himself up as governor there, or, if he was bold enough, maybe even as a king of a newly established nation stolen from the Ottomans. Now that's all wild speculation, but it would be super cool, wouldn't it? Regardless, whatever his plans may or may not have been, John Ward had no intention to leave his pirate ways behind. So, as per Sir Anthony's orders, Don Luis Fiascardio ordered the blockade of Algiers begun. Now, there was an initial bout of fighting when the Spanish fleet arrived, and their intentions became clear. Szymon Danziger was the admiral of the Algerian navy, so he wouldn't have wasted precious resources on attempting a direct strike against the Spanish, but he would have ordered a few ships to sail in and engage them. See, the Algerian navy was a privateer navy. Much like Port Royal some 65 years later, the privateers offered a sort of protection, but asking them to engage in a frontal assault against superior odds was unlikely to work out. Now, the Pasha did have a few round ships designed by Danziger, but they weren't enough to take on a small fleet of Spanish galleons. They had guns at the fort as well, but they were a bit too far from the Spanish to be of any use, unless the Spanish came in close. But that initial bout of fighting was instigated to allow a few ships to escape. Very likely, the Pasha wanted word sent out to Tunis and Tripoli, and probably Alexandria and even Istanbul, that he was under attack in Algiers. And then, Danziger and John Ward wanted to get a few ships out as well. Now, we don't know who he sent out, but whoever they were, they must have been that rare blend of expendable and invulnerable that makes for a perfect henchman. The sort of person who was able to get past the blockade and any patrols they might find in a small, quick vessel, but that would not be missed during the blockade should it come to battle. So the pirates engaged the Spanish fleet, kept their attention diverted until those small ships were well beyond the horizon. Then they pulled back into the harbor of Algiers and set to wait out the blockade. Don Luis had an impressive fleet there at Algiers. He was himself a skilled and honored commander at the head of at least half a dozen fully armed Spanish galleons. Now, that's not a wartime fleet, but combined with the smaller craft he had along with him, it was plenty to keep the pirates from escaping. But I do sort of wonder what Don Luis's plan was here. It's been suggested that the Spanish, Don Luis in particular, as well as his boss, Sir Anthony, didn't expect to find all of these pirates here in Algiers. They may have been chasing someone, one of Danziger's men maybe, or even Danziger himself, when they arrived at Algiers to find the harbor not only with a few pirate vessels, as they expected, but filled with pirate vessels. That force, combined with the guns from the fort of Algiers, would be far too much for the Spanish to take the harbor, let alone take the city. So they wouldn't be able to destroy the pirates here, but they could blockade the harbor. I tend to like that point of view, because if they did know what was going on in Algiers, all of these pirates assembled there, I wonder why they didn't team up with that Dutch fleet, maybe toss in the English that were left waiting at the strait, or maybe invite the Venetian navy to come join. A force like that could wipe up that pirate problem in an afternoon and take Algiers in not much more time than that. I mean, I know why they did it. The Spanish weren't exactly on good terms with England or the Netherlands or Venice. And then there were the diplomatic concerns to take into account when attacking a city that was still technically ruled by the Sultan. But even without those problems, assume they did destroy the pirates and take Algiers, well, what would they do with the city when they got it? If everyone here had been friendly and Catholic, like it was a crusade, they might have gifted the city to the Pope and made it sort of a crusader state, a Christian stronghold to check the power of Islam. But no one here but Spain was going to go along with something like that. Not Venice, not France, not the Netherlands, not England. So everyone here, the Spanish fleet and the Dutch and English pirates, waited around for something to happen. A blockade of this sort wasn't a siege. No one was going to starve or run out of water. They could get their food from inland as well as their water. But for a seaport, economically speaking at least, a blockade could be almost as deadly. But while they're waiting for something to happen, and we're waiting along with them, let's switch gears here. Far away from Barbary and a couple of 100 years from 1609, we're going to look at Newfoundland in modern-day Canada. It was found, or colonized, by the English explorer John Cabot, who had a charter from King Henry VII to, quote, "sail to all parts, countries, and seas of the east, the west, and of the north, under our banner and ensign, to set up our banner on any new-found land," end quote. Cabot did as he was ordered, and on what was probably the first uncharted territory he visited, he gave it the name Newfoundland, Newfoundland. But the Treaty of Tordesillas was only a couple of years old when this happened, and the Portuguese were still taking it seriously, and England was still Catholic and didn't want to go against a papal bull like the Treaty of Tordesillas, so they handed it on over to Portugal. But then, in 1585, England wasn't Catholic anymore, and Portugal was part of Spain, and England was at war with Spain, and Queen Elizabeth really wanted some colonies, especially if she could take them from the Spanish. Bernard Drake was a privateer and seafarer from Devon, in the west of England. We haven't talked about him before, but we have talked about Francis Drake, a young man from Devon who smote the Spanish and circumnavigated the globe, and who Queen Elizabeth granted a coat of arms in the form of a red dragon on a white background. That sigil, though, already belonged to somebody named Drake, Bernard Drake, and Bernard was very clear that he wasn't related to Francis Drake, so Drake couldn't have that sigil. I mean, what the heck, you're just going to give it away? He was upset by this. But Queen Elizabeth gave away the sigil anyway. But then Elizabeth sent Francis out to attack the Spanish New World in a preemptive strike in a war that had just begun. But in that same year, 1585, Elizabeth tasked another of her gentleman adventurers, Sir Walter Raleigh, and his Roanoke Company, with claiming land in North America. Now, Bernard Drake was related to Raleigh, distantly, by marriage. I mean, obviously, the two Drakes here were related. They shared a name and almost a hometown. But, you can't just go about claiming a man's sigil because you sailed around the globe. It's not that hard. Anyone could do that. I would totally do that, but, I've got to go to Newfoundland over here. In fact, it's very possible that Bernard Drake was more closely related to Francis than to Walter Raleigh. But he and Raleigh went along to Newfoundland, and Bernard Drake led a raid against the Spanish colony there. One report on the raid read, quote, "The voyage was both successful and profitable, beginning with the capture of a Portuguese ship laden with Brazilian sugar. Once at Newfoundland, Drake, meaning Bernard Drake, captured both Spanish and Portuguese fishing ships. He joined forces with George Raymond, and they seized ships coming from the West Indies with cargoes of sugar, wine, and ivory, and a French ship carrying some gold. In all, they probably took more than 20 ships. The voyage likely returned a profit of at least 600%. As their share, Drake and his eldest son John were given 4 of the most valuable ships by Raleigh and Sir John Gilbert." End quote. This was a fairly impressive privateer raid, and one of Elizabeth's earliest victories against Spain in the Anglo-Spanish War. Newfoundland became an important colony to the English. It was a home to many, many English adventurers and privateers. It had been a fishery for the Spanish, producing salted cod to feed their navy. For that reason alone, it was strategically important to Spain, but England had plenty of other places to produce salted cod. Newfoundland was far away from any other Spanish or Portuguese colonies. I'm fairly certain that St. Augustine in Florida was the closest. See, due to wind patterns in the Atlantic, for the Spanish to get from Spain to Newfoundland, they would have to sail north and west through English waters. So, the Spanish had a difficult time getting to what was strategically not the most important location in their war. Because of this, Newfoundland became a haunt for adventurers and privateers who had an interest in either the Atlantic coast of North America or the West Indies. It was sort of like a safe house for people who were moving down into Virginia or Carolina or even further south. One of these adventurers during the Anglo-Spanish War was a young man named Peter Easton, also called Peter Eston. Easton was a privateer who operated mostly out of Newfoundland. He started off as just a sailor, but by the end of the Anglo-Spanish War, he was a captain with a number of loyal commanders under him, something of a privateer admiral. He'd press-ganged hundreds of local, mostly Portuguese fishermen into what was a fairly impressive fleet for a privateer. He used Newfoundland as a home base from which to travel. Well, mostly he traveled south to the West Indies. Easton, he wasn't the first privateer to follow Francis Drake's lead and raid the Spanish in the West Indies, but he was perhaps the most prominent to do so since Drake. But he didn't capture trains of silver. He took the silver when he could, but mostly he captured supplies that were much needed by the colonists along the Atlantic coast. He was a little bit revered by some of those colonists for bringing them supplies that they otherwise wouldn't have had access to, but he wasn't playing Robin Hood here. They did have to pay for the supplies. However, he did keep them from starving on many occasions. And then, much like everyone in our current story, Easton's privateering license was revoked when James I took the throne. Now, men like Ward complied to this at first. Most of them did. They joined the Navy, but then they saw how awful life in the Navy was, so they went pirate. But Easton just kept up with his work. He knew it was illegal to continue privateering, but he didn't really care. He continued capturing Spanish shipping and selling the goods wherever it was needed. Perhaps he just enjoyed the money, or perhaps he considered it his responsibility. Perhaps he realized how much the people on the Atlantic coast would suffer without what he was doing. But he was named a pirate, and a price was put on his head. So Easton decided to get a little revenge on the English government. He continued raiding the Spanish, but he started selling goods not only to English colonists, but to Irish rebels on the west coast of Ireland, the same Irish pirates that fought under Grace O'Malley at one point. And those Irishmen welcomed Easton. They happily took the goods he traded, and all of them went to the war effort, and they even taught Easton some of their better smuggling and hunting spots around the British Isles, which is kind of a big deal. These were trade secrets that had belonged to some time to, sort of a guild of Irish pirates. So Peter Easton made use of all these new trade secrets and pretty quickly became the most prominent pirate operating in English waters. He continued attacking Spanish ships and then moved up to French vessels and finally started taking English ships as well. And it was around that time, when Peter Easton was becoming really prominent, that another pirate arrived in those Irish waters and made contact with Easton. His name was Tybalt Saxbridge, and he came, most recently, from Barbary. Saxbridge was one of Ward's men, or at least an associate of John Ward's. Now, I don't know why he was this far from Tunis, but it's fortunate that he was. He and Easton joined forces, and they ravaged shipping in the Channel and in the North Sea. They became something of a dream team there in England, or maybe a nightmare team if you were a member of the Navy or a merchant. But they were back there off the coast of Ireland when another pirate arrived with dire news. Probably. Now, there's not really any evidence of this, but it's, to me, sort of the only thing that makes sense. What we can say did happen is that Easton and Saxbridge and their fleet sailed from England to Barbary very quickly at just the right time to find Algiers and the pirates there under siege. Now, they might have left England for totally unrelated reasons. Maybe the Royal Navy was closing in. Maybe they heard about the Sotorina sinking and believed that Ward was dead and thought to make themselves, the next English pirate lords of the Mediterranean. But that's kind of unlikely because it would have taken a lot of time for that sort of word to reach England. I think it's most likely that John Ward was able to get word to them of his predicament on one of those ships that he sent out. So they rushed to Algiers, and when they arrived there, remember, these men were smugglers as much as pirates. They were able to smuggle word ashore that they were planning to help the pirates escape Algiers. Now, the fleet of Easton and Saxbridge was large. It was one of the more substantial pirate fleets in the world. But it wasn't defeat a Spanish strike force large. But they had a plan, probably Easton's plan. But that plan required Ward and Danziger and Pasha Redouan to all get on board. Of course, they were more than willing to. Shortly before dawn, a few days after they arrived, the fleet under Saxbridge and Easton sailed in toward the harbor of Algiers, silently as possible. Simon Danziger, Big Pete, John Ward, Bill Graves, Richard Bishop, Francis Verney, all the rest of the pirates were ready for this. They were already aboard their own ships with the guns primed and loaded. The soldiers under Redouan inside the fort of Algiers harbor had their own cannon at the ready, and everyone in Algiers, ready to fight, was waiting with bated breath. Then Saxbridge gave the order to fire. Every ship in his pirate fleet opened up with a volley of great shot intended to decimate the sleeping Spanish vessels. Now, normally, the Spanish would have just fired back here. They could have overwhelmed the pirates there quickly. However, as soon as Saxbridge opened fire, the pirates under Ward, many of those that had been under blockade, they made their way behind the Spanish ships. Picture the blockade something like this. The harbor at Algiers has a narrow opening up into a large bay. The Spanish fleet had their ships arrayed perpendicular to that opening. Their guns were pointed at the harbor mouth and out to sea. Anyone who arrived or tried to escape the harbor would be in range of their guns. But when they were all focused out to sea, at the fleet of Saxbridge and Easton, John Ward sailed up to the east and got in behind their vessels. Then he opened fire on the Spanish from the rear, and this put the Spanish into a sort of a pincer move, if an imperfect one, although purposefully imperfect. The Spanish weren't able to move into position to fire on John Ward. If they did so, they would leave themselves open to fire from Saxbridge, and they were already vulnerable to fire from John Ward. If they ordered half of their ships to focus on Ward and the other half to focus on Saxbridge and his pirates, their fleet would be cut in half and they would be slowly losing a battle of attrition. So they had two options. First, they could sail for the harbor. That was the fastest mode of escape and may have been the safest looking. Second, they could sail away from Ward and Saxbridge, out to the west, and away from Algiers. Now, that was a more dangerous move. It would leave them under fire for longer. So, they initially made for the harbor. At least some of their ships started heading in that direction. But Don Luis thought better of that. And that was a good move on his part. See, the guns in the fort at Algiers were already loaded, ready to fire should the Spanish come in range. And Simon Danziger and all of his Dutch pirates were waiting in the harbor and prepared to force the Spanish, once they sailed into the harbor, directly into range of the fort's guns. That would have been a slaughter, but the Spanish commander saw through that and ordered his ships to leave through the one direction that they were left, the water of Algiers and the blockade against the pirates for good. This was a quick, almost surgical strike. It showed the kind of tactics that the pirates were capable of when they had the numbers. Minimal damage was done to the Spanish shipping, but the Spanish sailors had been under such a barrage so quickly that their will and morale and maybe even some of their good sense just left them. Ward and Danziger, along with all the rest of the pirates of Barbary that were all gathered in Algiers harbor, won a victory and chased them off. Now, that was a better position than they'd been in weeks. It's better to have no enemies blockading the harbor than some enemies blockading the harbor. But in a way, this took their position from bad to worse. As it turns out, Algiers had been home for the past few weeks of hundreds or maybe even a few thousand pirates. All of them were stuck in the city and unable to leave, so tensions had begun to mount. Normally, pirates would be going out on voyages and making money to buy things in town, but instead, they ran out of money very quickly but still consumed whatever they pleased, mostly on credit. In normal times, in Algiers, there would have been a fraction of Danziger's fleet gallivanting around town, drinking heavily and looking for a good time. But for all of these weeks that the city had been under blockade, there were almost triple the number of his men growing bored and, running low on wine. It became an expensive and occasionally violent problem. During the blockade, the pirates and many of the locals clashed a number of times, and the Pasha was growing tired of the situation. But he couldn't, ask them to leave because there was a Spanish blockade out there, and he couldn't arrest the pirates because, first of all, they were the only thing guarding his harbor, and second, there were way too many of them for him to arrest. Had he attempted to do so, or even started arresting a few pirates who got really out of line, the chances of order breaking down into civil disobedience and perhaps his overthrow were growing high. But now that the Spanish were gone, Pasha Redouan made it clear to Danziger and Ward that he wanted these pirates out of his city and his harbor. Danziger and his men were more than welcome to come back after they had captured some prizes of worth. Pasha Redouan would buy them, and he would consider buying prizes or goods from Ward if they were particularly nice. But until such time as they had something to contribute to the city, the pirates were kicked out. And, they were ready to leave anyway. They didn't want to stick around any longer, but they realized that Algiers, much like Tunis, might not be as friendly as it had been. So they gathered in the harbor there at Algiers and discussed their plans. Next time, we're going to talk about what may have been the greatest event of this era of the Pirates of Barbary, and then we're going to begin to draw this story toward its close. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everyone who has become a patron on Patreon, everybody who has left us a review on iTunes or wherever it is you listen to the show, everybody who has donated to the show through the website or recommended this show to your friends and family. Without all of you, I wouldn't be able to do this, so thank you. If you'd like to help support the show, the best way to do so is to become a patron at patreon.com/piratehistorypodcast. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, I certainly suggest you do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com, or you can get in touch on Twitter, SoundCloud, or YouTube. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.